Roberts along, and this guy is a fan favorite. We exploit him once a week on this show. Great takes on so many things. Such a terrific historian when it comes to American politics and geopolitics in general. How about it for the great John Rothman, everyone? He does have a podcast, which is very popular. It's screaming up the charts. Albert, do you have his banner? Or can we put up his banner with his podcast to remind everyone that that is the podcast he has? Maybe, Kim, you can do that. Anyway, John, welcome, sir. There it is. It's called Around the World with John Rothman.
Thank you for the plug. I have to tell you, my producer tells me we are approaching 10,000, and we've only been up for 3 weeks. So we're very excited about that. And Around the Political World with John Rothman, just Google it and come along for the ride.
Yeah, that's terrific. It took us how long to get to 10,000, Albert? It took us better part of, I want to say.
I'd say like 6 months, maybe.
Yeah, 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, look at Rothman. Picks up 10K in 3 weeks. All right. I'm not competitive. If I were, I'd realize that I'm losing the competition.
You'll never lose. You're a winner. And by the way, I want to point out, when you were talking about tennis, I couldn't help thinking what a racket that is.
Oh, wow.
Sorry.
Really? You give him applause for that? That's what got you the 10,000?
Yeah.
Wordplay like that? Well, the crowd likes it. The crowd likes it. All right, you got to get. All right, now, John Rothman, let's get serious here, all right? Now, I want to first double back and just check off on the homeless problem. Here it is. Vilma's asking, how would John Rothman handle the homeless problem in San Francisco? Go ahead.
I talked about it this morning on my podcast. I did it because there is now an effort by some to demonize San Francisco. So the answer is that there is no real answer. But we have, for instance, Glide Church, which not only provides meals for thousands, but also provides social services. And it seems to me that that is the model. The model is to be able to help people who need help, and that means social services have to be beefed up. Unfortunately, there is no way to clear the streets of the homeless. And that's not just San Francisco. I was in Portland last week, and they have a similar problem, and we see it across the country. Homelessness is a real crisis for America, and the mental health issues, and particularly fentanyl, remain a serious problem in terms of dealing with the problem. So, and there are limitations. We heard this morning a story, I was fascinated by it, that when you are confronted by the police, if you say you don't want any help, they can't force you to do anything. And as you were recounting to Kim earlier, your encounter with a homeless person who encamped by your back wall, and you essentially for 6 months were left in a position of not being able to solve it. So here's my point, Mark. Any politician who says that they can solve the homeless problem or they can solve the drug problem is not telling you the truth. All we can do is provide the best services we can. I do happen to favor keeping the streets clean. And one of the points I made is that's why we have a DPW, Department of Public Works in San Francisco, and their job should be to keep the streets clean, which is not the case and ought to be.
Well, let me just press you a little bit on this because It sounds like, I mean, to be cynical, I could say, well, that's more of the same then. You're saying provide city services and there's social counseling and Glide Church, et cetera. But that's really, you talk about incremental, that may not even get you incremental progress on this. So let me just press you a little.
You're correct.
So, and you've made the point that any politician who, says they can solve the problem is obviously misrepresenting something. So I think we all agree to that. But what policies can you see? What leaks in all that money that we're directing toward homelessness are there that could be addressed in some creative way? Is there anything, John?
Yeah, there are several priorities. The first priority is to keep the streets clean. That is to say, you really have to have people out there making sure that streets are clean.
Now, wait a minute. When you say the streets are clean, you're talking about literally, all the feces and all of that stuff. But what about the people on the streets, John?
Okay. Well, that's the second point. The The second point is that we have to beef up the services we provide people who are on the street. People who want help should be given help. Our problem is the people who don't want help, you can't force them to have help. And anyone who says that there's an answer on that is crazy. Look, Mark, if I had a magic wand and could wave it, that would be one thing. But I had a situation where one of my kids said, can't we just arrest them all and deport them for being vagrants? And of course, vagrancy laws are now unconstitutional. You can't apply those laws. The only thing we can do are the public health aspects, which, by the way, were enforced pretty vigorously at the height of the pandemic. I would suggest that homelessness is a pandemic in San Francisco.
Well, clearly, I mean, I don't think you got a lot of argument here. I mean, in the chat, they're saying, so as mayor, you would let the homeless people stay on the street the way they are now?
No, absolutely not. What we would have to do is to find vehicles, ways in which, number one, to assure sanitary conditions, and number two, to arrange something, and I don't know what it is, but that will require real thought, to how to get people off the streets. Let me tell you something. I live here in San Francisco. I can drive 3 blocks away from my house, and you have a tent encampment on Masonic. It's unacceptable. And my son lives south of Market, at least for another month. He's giving up his apartment there. And on Mission Street, there are several blocks where you cannot walk without the problem of sanitation and drugs. And there's open drug dealing. If there's open drug dealing, why isn't that stopped? Isn't that something we ought to be doing? And I say it is. If you see someone shooting up or someone using fentanyl, by God, the police, the sheriff's department ought to be there in order to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, there is a problem, Mark, and I'll be blunt with you. You can, if you don't see it, it doesn't mean it isn't there. They simply shift from one place to another place, and it creates a serious problem. And I would be lying to people, and any politician, whether they were running for mayor or for any public office, would be lying if they said they could clean it up with one fell swoop. All you can do, and I really believe this to be true, is apply sanitation laws. That is to say, the streets must be clean, they must be passable. You can't do drug dealing on the streets. And by the way, I think it's very important to crack down on drug dealers. And that means the individual drug dealer as well.
You know, I'm seeing it in the chat. You know, can't you go after these people for loitering? Can't you go after these people? You know, the reality, and there is maybe some running room there, but you can't arrest someone for loitering per se. They do a thing, I think, John, you may know this better than I, where if you're loitering to do something like to commit a crime or to sell alcohol or buy alcohol, or if you're loitering to, in other words, they have to connect it to another activity besides just being there. Although
you have to be able to
failure to disperse is a crime, John.
But there's a presumption of innocence. That is to say, you cannot arrest someone or detain someone on the premise that you think they're going to do something. That's a serious problem. But let me make clear, it's not just San Francisco. It's across every community in the United States. And we in San Francisco are blessed with good climate. We talked about climate last week, but let me just point out what's happening in Florida, what's happening in Southern California, what's happening all over the place in terms of climate. And this climate problem is going to create an even more serious problem. We in San Francisco have a mild climate, and we are a community which wants to help people, and that makes us even more attractive. I'm not sure that's a negative. I think it's important that people understand what San Francisco and what our positions represent. But
wanting to help people is one thing, but I mean, here, loitering is the least of it. They're dealing, using, defecating, fornicating,
and that should not be permitted.
Yeah, no, it's true.
What can I tell you?
You get it in order, you get extra points.
If I were San Francisco, there would be enforcement, and I would insist on it, and I'm sure then I'd be attacked as someone who is violating civil liberties. But you should not have a civil liberty which takes away a civil liberty from someone else. And here in San Francisco, you've been to the Golden Gate Theater lately? Have you seen the loitering around the Golden Gate Theater?
You can't even get into the theater.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And that's the kind of thing where there has to be action taken. And I commend Mayor Breed. I want to say something positive about what the mayor has done. She's now coordinating the sheriff's department, the police department, the law enforcement here in San Francisco. Gavin Newsom, to his credit, is now putting highway patrol into San Francisco. But you said something, Mark, that really hit me. We have spent countless millions of dollars on this problem with virtually no result, which means I think you got to bring together the best minds in the city, business, labor, management, communities, neighborhoods. I want to know what neighborhood groups are saying about this. Restaurant owners who are having a terrible problem now with loitering as you go to a restaurant. I mean, unless we solve these problems, then San Francisco is in trouble. But I want to make very clear, and I talked about it this morning on my podcast, and I talked about the demonization of San Francisco. There is a demonization taking place, which we have to resist as well. This is a great city with great opportunities, with marvelous restaurants, with marvelous views, with marvelous people who live here. And we need to reinforce that positive thing. That includes, by the way, the problem we're now having with businesses moving out of San Francisco and massive vacancies.
I mean, I just saw that Anchor Brewery is closing.
Anchor Brewery is closing. And this is a tremendous blow to an independent business here in San Francisco. I happen to know someone who worked at Anchor Brewery for many, many years, very proud of what they did. These are the kinds of things where I don't know whether government can make a difference, but I do know the people of San Francisco have to unite, and we have to get our business and political leaders together and our labor leaders together to figure out if there are real solutions. And Mark, it may be there are no solutions, and that should really blow us away.
Well, there has to be a strategy, and in that latest report that I was talking about in the last half hour lays it out. Most people, I mean, really, the majority of homeless people are looking for permanent housing. So this permanent housing that can be set up, can be purchased, can be built, that will address a big chunk of this problem. But some of these other problems you talk about, like drug abuse and, you know, this horror show that is some of the streets of San Francisco and other cities, Los Angeles and et cetera, and Sacramento and across the country, that isn't addressed by permanent housing.
You're right. And affordable housing is an oxymoron. There is no affordable housing. And when you build affordable housing, theoretically, it doesn't stay affordable very long because there's greater and greater demand. So this is a serious issue which cannot be solved by one person, which cannot be solved by one government. It requires people to come together. Look, Mark, when we had the AIDS crisis here in San Francisco, it was a disaster for businesses, for people in this city. What did the city do? We came together, we put together a program, including health services, in order to try to mitigate what was a growing disaster. We've seen, I remember, and many of you do, the great earthquake that took place not so many years ago. We were devastated. What do? We came together and we resolved the issues. This is a thing which is only going to be resolved by serious people working together in San Francisco. And that means all segments of the city, not particular ethnic or religious or political groups, but all the people. And let me tell you, leadership requires we bring them together. I always remember former Mayor George Christopher, who was a good friend of mine, who said that during his term of office, there were serious issues over labor negotiations. And he said, look, John, he said, I simply brought labor and business together, put them in a room and said, let's work this out because it hurts all of us and it hurts the city. And if we believe, as I do, that this is a great city, and this is not just San Francisco, as you point out, it's Los Angeles, it's all over California, we better work together to solve the problem or it's only going to grow. And climate change, by the way, and I mentioned this very briefly, is only going to exacerbate the problem because people who live in climates where you can't live are going to move to climates where you can live, and it's going to be a serious problem. If you want to live somewhere with a mild climate, it's San Francisco. And even though we're going to have a heat wave this weekend, evidently,
well, not in San Francisco. I mean, you'll have it around the Bay Area, but in the city, it'll be like 75 degrees or something.
Right. You're right, and that will mean more and more.
That brings, but you're saying it's a magnet as things get worse elsewhere. Yeah. he used a ding word, Albert, and I don't know what it is. I forget because I was paying attention to what John was saying, but I remember registering that it was a ding. Exacerbate, that's what it was. Thank you. So, John, my last follow-up, and then I want to turn to national and international. Essentially, just to understand your position, your thought is to put together a task force or a group that regularly meets, maybe monthly meetings. You're talking about business owners, religious leaders, homeless advocates, etc. And you want to put them together.
Not a meeting. I would bring them together immediately, and I would say,
we're
going to work on this, and we have 72 hours. Let's come up with concrete things that we can do, not to solve the problem, but to ameliorate the problem, to provide some services. And let's take a look at where we're spending our money. Are we spending our money in a place which is truly effective? And what are our immediate goals? I'm going to tell you, and I said it before, cleaning the streets. When I was a kid, do you know how they solved part of the unemployment problem here in San Francisco? They hired street sweepers. They didn't have machines doing it. They had people come in, and the streets were really cleaned, and you made sure they were clean. That's the kind of thing we need to do in San Francisco. And by the way, for those people who are homeless and who need employment, that might not be a bad way of putting people to work in their own neighborhoods in order to clean things up. I take a walk in the Tenderloin, or I take a walk south of Market, and I see what's happening, and it's just a disaster. But I believe in San Francisco. This city had a slogan for years, the city that knows how. And that's what we have to do, and we can only do it if we get together and really come up with concrete action.
I made the point before that we're all a couple of personal crises away from living in our car. I mean, it could happen to any of us, but I love San Francisco, and I love that you love San Francisco the way you do. And I get the pride associated with living in the city and with the values reflected in the city and the diversity in the city and all these things. But John, you have to admit, it's out of control. Not just homelessness, the crime. And businesses are shuttering. I just mentioned Anchor Brewery, but I'm talking about businesses across every place from North Beach to Market Street.
You're 100% correct, and that's why immediate action. We can't wait for the next election, Mark. This is something which needs to be addressed today by our current political leadership. They have to put the next election aside, personal ambition aside. They have to work as a unit. That's what we did during the AIDS crisis. Do you remember what we had to do here in San Francisco and how effective it was, and the anger in the community when the bathhouses were closed, for instance, the anger, the cries of discrimination. And yet what happened was a plus for the people of San Francisco, all the people of San Francisco. And that's the kind of immediate action that I think we need now. And I hope we're able to do it.
I'll tell you one thing, as mayor, you will gain, were you ever to ascend to that position, you would gain tremendous support immediately if you were to clean the streets. I mean, I love that you come back to that. It's sort of like the pothole thing. You know what I mean? I mean, if you really address it, honestly, that is an issue. And in cleaning the streets, you have to deal on some level with those who are living on the streets. So that would. Yeah.
But let me tell you, whether I choose to run for mayor, and I am giving it serious thought, and I have a lot of support, but whether I choose to run or not, the real issue will be what we do because the election isn't until November of 2024. It's what happens now. We can't let it get worse. And so what I'm suggesting ought to be undertaken by people in positions of authority now. London Breed is the mayor of San Francisco, the board of supervisors, all of those entities that exist need to be willing to tackle the problem now because we can't afford to wait.
And I like what Kim said before. She was talking about what they're doing in Texas, and you look at Los Angeles, and Los Angeles looks at San Francisco, et cetera. And Sacramento looks at both. We're almost out of time, but I just want to quickly ask you about the world stage, world events, and politics. What's moving your meter?
Well, I listened this morning to the president who spoke at the NATO summit in Lithuania, and my son asked me a very simple question. Why aren't we admitting Ukraine right now? And the answer is because of Article 5. If Ukraine were admitted, all of the Western nations associated with NATO would then be at war with Russia. And what Joe Biden is doing is proceeding very prudently, saying to the Ukrainians, yes, you'll get in, but the war has to end first. And in the meantime, we're going to give you what you need. I want to make my position clear on cluster weapons. I hate that term. It's a euphemism. Cluster weapons are cluster bombs. And those of us who have had any experience in warfare understand that it is a deadly weapon, and it is the last thing we ought to be providing because it doesn't solve a problem. More than that, where are they dropping these cluster bombs? And I'm going to use the term bombs, not weapons. They're dropping them in Ukraine, which means that when the war is over, we're going to have to clean up that mess as well. NATO, the allies have to work directly to try to ameliorate and provide the situation that Ukraine needs, understanding that this is going to be a long haul. And to Joe Biden's credit, he has said that, and I give him a lot of credit for it. He's not talking about copping out. One other quick comment. I listened this morning to the director of the FBI giving testimony before the House of Representatives. And I want to make clear, I am horrified by the Republicans on that committee who continue to go after the director and the FBI as an institution, continuing to press these outrageous things. Look at the whole Joe Biden, Hunter Biden thing. The man who the Republicans were counting on to be their key link in the chain that would nail the Bidens, is now under indictment himself and has no credibility. And the Republicans have to wake up and deal with this. Let me also quickly say, because I do like to talk about Donald Trump, these next few weeks, Mark, are going to be absolutely fascinating because Donald Trump is going to be indicted. There's no question about it. He's going to be indicted again in Georgia, and he's going to be indicted again on the January 6th. And the Republicans may go crazy. And one of the most disturbing things to me is that every time he's indicted, Donald Trump's ratings go up. One other quick point. I know we're running out of time.
He's shown some softening actually in the last couple of weeks, John. I mean, that is, his overall numbers are beginning to soften a bit. But yeah, I will grant you the fact that he's still way ahead of everyone else.
All he has to do in Iowa, all he has to do in New Hampshire is to win 25, 30, 35, 40% of the vote, which the polls say he will, and he'll have the nomination in hand.
Right.
And let me say a quick word about this question of the woman's right to choose. The decision that Mike Pence has made to support these efforts to 6 weeks until you ban abortion completely is absolutely wrong. And we're seeing this in a major state of this union where a bill is going to be signed on Friday by a Republican governor with a Republican legislature to do that. And it's so horrifying to me. So there are a whole host of issues, Mark. We don't have enough time.
No, I mean, that's why you have your great podcast, sir, because you can address many of these things. But you've touched on a lot. I was going to follow up on this. Randy says, apparently cluster bombs is the last thing we have because Biden pretty much came out and admitted that we're running short in the U.S. on other munitions, didn't he?
Let me point out, and I say this very respectfully, we do not produce munitions in large numbers. We produce weapons that we need. Joe Biden's been in office 2 years. Look back and see that the munitions production under Donald Trump would have produced the same result. The problem is that no one expected that there would be a ground war in Europe, the largest ground war in Europe since World War II. And how do you prepare for that? How do you deal with it now? Frankly, Vladimir Putin has to be held accountable. I don't blame Joe Biden any more than I would actually blame Donald Trump. This has been a consistent problem in terms of our lack of preparation because we don't want to have to prepare for this kind of ground war. We're sitting here in the United States of America, but do you know what a ground war in Ukraine means? I have friends in Ukraine, and I get these reports, and I'm horrified by what's happening on the ground. And there is no real focus on what is essentially a major war. And let me point out, we have a nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, which the Russians now control, but they have weapons all the way around it. And if that plant were blown the same way the Russians blew the dam, which caused major flooding, believe me, we'd have a major international crisis.
Let me just ask you again and follow up, and then we'll wrap up with John Rothman. But you then have strongly said here just now that you oppose providing these cluster bombs to Ukraine. happens then? So you're now president of the United States, and or you're master of the world in this case, and just for this hypothetical, what would you do then?
I would ramp up production on the kinds of weapons that they really can use, the kind of munitions they can really use. I would sit down with the best military people and say, what do we need to do? And their answer is not going to be cluster bombs, because cluster bombs don't win a war.
So cluster bombs, as you know, are used to dig out a lot of the trenched in troops of your enemy, your opposition, in this case, the Russians. Mm-hmm. And they are trenched in, as you're also aware, in these portions of Ukraine that they're having trouble dislodging them from. So the answer is that they feel these cluster bombs are the way. Now, I'm not advocating for them. In fact, I think it's an abhorrent thing. But that said, it is explained by many who know this sort of military theater that is the way to address the fact that the Russians are dug in these trenches.
The only way this can be done properly, Mark, is to get the Russians out. That means world pressure. Many nations are still having economic ties with Russia. It's not the kind of economic boycott or pressure that should have been applied. There are a variety of things that can be done, that should be done, that are not being done. And let me tell you, I'm in favor of giving the Ukrainians whatever they need in order to do it. I have no problem with that. My problem with cluster bombs is that the minute they use the euphemism cluster weapons, I hit the roof. I said, if you're going to give it to them, explain what it really is. You understand what a cluster bomb is. And eventually, the people who are going to suffer are the people of Ukraine. I don't think it's a weapon that's a legitimate weapon of war. And that's the reason why so many nations, over 100 nations in the world, have advocated for banning these kinds of weapons. But you know what, Mark? They deal with what they have to deal with. And Zelensky wants the West to be actively involved. Why do you think he wants to get into NATO so quickly? Because under Article 5, we would all be at war with Russia.
Sure, Zelensky's doing what he has to do, which is to try to draw us in.
Biden, to his credit, doesn't want to get into a war with Russia. But it comes to another question, and it's something we can talk about at another time, and that is, how far do we go in this battle?
Well, that's kind of sort of what I was saying or getting to with the questions about cluster bombs. I mean, okay, great, call them cluster bombs, whatever, and you don't want to give them to Ukraine. Great. Now, what do you want to do? How involved do you want to be? Do you want to see Ukraine fall? I mean, I know you don't want that, but I guess what I'm trying to say is all of these various junctures in this confrontation are played out this way. Like, if you don't help, they're falling.
Cluster bombs will not win anything for the Ukrainians. It's an oxymoron when you talk about that.
So why do they exist then as a weapon? I don't mean to press this. I'm really asking the question.
No, I think it's a great question. Why? We have a surplus because we don't use them. We have a surplus of those kinds of weapons. But there are many weapons that we could be using, that we have sent them, which have been effective, which we need to resupply them with, which means, if you want to be completely blunt, we have to gear up our factories in this country to produce those weapons. And the Europeans will have to cooperate in that as well. But look, how do you fight a war with one hand tied behind your back? What is the reason we do not go all in? Because Russia has a nuclear capability. And our fear, and Joe Biden's fear, and he's expressed it very eloquently, his fear is that there will be a nuclear conflagration if this thing is pushed too far. And
you don't think we're all in now, John? I mean, I know we don't have troops on the ground, but it's a proxy war. I mean, we're pretty all in, I would say, already.
No,
I mean, how much money have we spent? I mean, just look at money and weaponry and,
Billions. I heard the report this morning, billions. But we've avoided a direct confrontation with Russian troops. And I would point out to you, the cluster bomb would not be used on Russia. It would be used in Ukraine.
Yeah, it would be used on Russians in Ukraine. Right.
Inevitably, then you're going to hit Ukrainians too.
Well, Right. I mean, the idea would be that it would be again, not to get too in the weeds, but that it would be directed toward these trenches. Although I saw Huge in Japan, who kind of knows. I've just noticed his comments have sort of been pretty well informed. I think he says it wouldn't help with trenches. But we had David K. Johnson on the Pulitzer Prize winner yesterday. He said that is actually how you address trench warfare. And Huge in Japan is also saying this. This is, I mean, again. Individual bomblets dropped en masse from drones into trenches. That works, he says. There is a school of thought which is that they are going to dismantle many of these cluster weapons, cluster bombs, and take a lot of the innards out and then attach them to drones. As I'd heard that from somebody. Again,
the horror of it
yeah.
is almost indescribable.
And the first casualty of war is the truth. So I have no idea what actually is happening there, nor do any of us. But yeah.
But let me tell you, the interesting thing for Joe Biden is the political differences now within the Democratic Party over the question of the use of these weapons. But let's be clear. Let's not just say cluster weapons, because that doesn't define it. It is a bomb with a devastating effect, which can have an impact years afterward. I was drawing the analogy with a friend the other day of Agent Orange. We know the impact of these things. Please note, Agent Orange is not being used against the Russians. Do you know why? Because there was an agreement made by nations not to use that kind of weapon. After World War I, there was a decision not to use poison gas. That's why we didn't see the kind of gas that was used during World War I in World War II. We saw gas used in a different way in World War II, a more fateful, a more destructive way. But
well, I mean, you talk about agreements, and Agent Orange is a good example. But there was an agreement, a worldwide agreement on cluster bombs, and we didn't sign it. I mean, there's a worldwide agreement on the Hague and the International Court, and we don't sign that either. I mean, I think we're a lawless nation that way. We're not ready to now. And go ahead, I can see you.
Lawless, but I do want to agree with you. We have made certain choices. I was deeply involved in the genocide treaty struggle. For years, the United States would not sign the genocide treaty. Finally, we did, but it took years of persistent effort on the part of many of us who were involved in the human rights struggle. These things take time, but I have to tell you what worries me. It's the same thing going back to where we started on the streets of San Francisco. You can think of these in global terms, but you have to think of it on individual terms. The devastation to individuals, whether it's on the streets of San Francisco because of drugs, or whether it is in Ukraine where the Ukrainian people themselves are suffering. And the fact is, when the United Nations was created in San Francisco in 1945, the whole goal was to prevent these kinds of things happening in war. And although it's prevented a third world war, the UN can take credit for that. Actually, what credit is deserved is because of nuclear capability. We should be afraid of what we've developed, and we need to have responsible leadership to deal with it. And I agree with those nations who would not produce the cluster bomb, not weapon, but bomb, because of its danger. It's just an abhorrent weapon. I agree on that.
Leslie Van Houten, the Manson follower, who just got out after 49 years locked up, would you have released her or not?
No, I would not have released her. What she did and the participation, none of the Manson gang should ever be released. She can go through rehab in jail. She can lead a constructive life behind bars, but she should not be granted freedom. And if I'd been governor, that would have been my position.
John Rothman.
Wait. I lived in Los Angeles during those days. I'll never forget the terror that they brought. But may I say, it's always a high honor and great personal privilege, and I look forward to next Wednesday.
Well, I enjoy it as well, my friend. Catch him on the podcast Around the World with John Rothman.
Around the political world.
Around the political world with John Rothman. Put it together for John Rothman. Thanks, John Rothman. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.